So yesterday we were learning about the height of the kloim and the size of the mizbeach. We ended up having a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosy, and it was all based on a pasuk in Malachim where Shlomo Melech, where the pasuk says that Shlomo Melech increased the size of the mizbeach, and he included in the kedushas of mizbeach all of the floor of the azara. And we had a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosy, who Rabbi Yehuda said it was Dvarim Kiksavim. Literally, Shlomo Melech was Mekadosh, the floor of the Azara, to be just like the surface of the Mizbeach. And the Gemara said, even though Rabbi Yehuda understands that that's what Shlomo Melech did, the service of the Azara only had the status of the service of the Mizbeach, legabe being makter, burning the karbanis there. But Lagabe Zrika Stam, everybody agrees has to be mamish on the Mizbeach. Rabbi Yosy said, if you analyze the pasuk says that the reason why Shlomo HaMelech had to give the whole Azara status of a Mizbeach is because they were makriv 142,000 karbanis the day of the Chanukas HaMizbeach, and it would have been impossible to fit all those on the small Mizbeach that was there from Moshe Rabbeinu, or the same size Mizbeach as was there by Moshe Rabbeinu, which got into an entire discussion as to how big was that Mizbeach. So we learned that Rabbi Yosy learns the Mizbeach in total was 5 by 5, meaning the work area, the area on it for the Maracha would have only been 1 by 1, which means, and we know for a fact that in that 1 by 1 area, Shlomo was able to be makrav 1,000 karbanis. So therefore, if you had a mizbeach with a work area of 20 by 20, which is 400 square amas, you should have room for 400,000 karbanis, which is much more than 142,000. So why would there have been a problem with the size of the mizbeach that Shlomo had to make the entire Azara Kodesh? So because of that kasha, Rabbi Yosy learns that it doesn't literally mean that he made the whole Azara Kodesh. He just meant, the Gemara is going to say soon, that he made the Azara Kodesh so that it could contain a mizbeach. He gave it Kedushas Azara, but not Kedushas HaMizbeach. The Rabbi Yehuda held that the Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu was not 5 by 5. It was actually 10 by 10, which means there were many more square feet or square amos on the Mizbeach. And based on that ratio, there wouldn't be anywhere near enough space on the Mizbeach to bring 142,000 karbanis, because he learned it was 36 square amas. You had an area of 6 by 6 to be able to be makriv 1,000 karbanis, which works out to about 27 karbanis per square meter, not 1,000, and therefore even the 400 square amas of the larger mizbeach wouldn't be able to handle the 142,000, and therefore it justifies why Shlomo Melech gave the whole floor of the Azara the status of the surface of the Mizbeach. Then the Gemara got into the height of the Mizbeach and the Chayshes. The pasuk says, Sholosh Amos Kaimasai, and Rabbi Yehuda learns the Dvarim Kiksavim. It was 3 amos high, and it was 10 by 10. That was the dimensions of the Mizbeach and the Chayshes. While Rabbi Yosy learns, first of all, he learns it wasn't 10 by 10 high, right? It was only 5 by 5 as far as its surface area. Its height, Zokt Rabbi Yosy, was twice the distance of one of its sides, and that we learned from his Mizbech HaKteres. So if each side was 5 amos, according to Rabbi Yosy, then the Mizbech was 10 amos high. The Gemara asked if the Mizbech was 10 amos high. Now we have to look at the height of the kloim. The pasuk says the height of the kloim was 5 amos. If the height of the kloim was 5 amos and the height of the Mizbech was 10 amos, that means there's no tznius. Any work that the kohen is doing on the Mizbech can be seen far and wide by people. So the Gemara brought 2 other psukim, one that said the kloim were 10 amos and one that said there were 15 amos. And the Gemara concludes, according to Rabbi Yosy, that in fact that the kloim were 15 amos high, the Mizbech was 10 amos high, perfect screen. But going back to Rabbi Yehuda, who learned that the Mizbech is only 3 amos high, and the kloim are only 5 amos high, well, that means if the kohen is standing on top of the Mizbeach, the barrier, the kloim, only come up 2 amos. 2 amos is about 4 feet, maybe 3 feet. So even though the lower half of the kohen would be concealed, but anyone would be able to see the kohen from his shoulders and above, would see that from far and wide, and that would lack of tznius. So the Gemara said, no, we don't have a problem if people see the kohen there on top of the mizbeach. Our concern is only if they could see what he's doing, if they could see the avodah happening. But if it's just seeing the kohen up there, that would not have posed any problem at all. And that's where we left off yesterday. So the Gemara says, El Rabbi Yehuda, the kohen mischazi, even though the kohen could be seen because he's standing on the mizbeach that's 3 amos high, and the barrier is only 5 amos in total, nevertheless, avodah de biyadoi loy mischazi. The avodah that the kohen was doing is not visible, and therefore it doesn't lack its knees, and that's all that we're concerned about, that no one can see what the kohen is doing. Zog to Gemara, Bishlama Rabbi Yehuda. Bishlama, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Hanyu Dechsev Kidesh. Rabbi Yehuda says it's literal. Devarim Kiksavan Shloima Melech was Mekadesh the entire floor of the Hazara. So let's have a look at the pasuk. It says Vayomahu Kidesh Hamelech Es Toich Echatzer. The touch of that word means he was Mekadesh. So that makes perfect sense according to Rabbi Yehuda's approach. Elul Rabbi Yosy, my Kidesh. What do you mean he was Mekadesh? He wasn't Mekadesh. Zok to Gemara, what it means is Lahamid Ba Mizbeach. He gave the Azara a Kedushas HaAzara, that now a Mizbeach can be placed in it. As Rashi says, Umeshani Kitshay L'Shem Azara Lahamid Ba Mizbeach Avon. So he was Mekadesh the Azara, but that doesn't mean he gave it the same level of Kedusha as the Mizbeach itself. It got Kedushas Azara, so now you could place a Mizbeach in it. Who learns Kiddush is mamish. How you dechsev cotton? That's why it says cotton again. Looking at the pasuk, Vayoymahu Kiddush Hamelech es toich hechatzer asher lefnei beis Hashem ki asa shomes ha'oilo v'shamincha v'schel v'ashlamim he mizbach hanechoshes asher lefnei Hashem. The mizbach hanechoshes, the mizbach that they had from the Mishkan was cotton. It simply wasn't big enough to process all the karbanos that were being brought that day. So because it was too small. El Rabbi Yehuda, my katan. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there was never a problem with the mizbeach because he held it that there was plenty of room, and the azara only had kedushas azara, not kedushas mizbeach. So what was the issue with katan? Zogt Gemara Hachik Amar Mizbeach Avonim she'asa Shloima Tachas Mizbeach HaNechoshes Katan Hava. The Mizbeach Even that the Shloima Melech made, that was there to replace the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, so it doesn't read as well. Yes, it's not Dvarim Kiksavam. It doesn't read as well. It just means that Mizbeach was small. And therefore he needed a bigger mizbeach. But the bigger mizbeach, in fact, was enough. So as we said on the Nun Tes Amar Aleph, it was like saying that the mizbeach wasn't quite big enough. We need an upgrade. So he said it in a nice way that it's small, but he didn't really mean to say that it was too small. It was too small to do anything. So let's read the Lashon HaPasuk according to Rabbi Yehuda, which is not Devarim Kiksavim, like Rabbi Yosy, which is not Devarim Kiksavim, so it doesn't read as Geshmak. But Yomahu Kidesh HaMelech Es Toich Echatzer. Okay, that fits in good. He was Mekadesh with a status of Chotzer, not a status of Mizbeach. Asher Lefnei Beis Hashem. Why? Because Kiyas Hashem is Ha'ilov V'Samincha V'Schavei Shlamim Ki Mizbeach or Ki Mizbeach HaNechoshes Asher Lefnei Hashem Katoin V'Yachal Es Ha'ilov. First of all, we already said that the Mizbeach there was 20 by 20. It wasn't the Mizbeach and the Choshesh. What it means is that the reason why Shlomo decided to make a new Mizbeach Avonim is because the Mizbeach and the Choshesh was a little bit small. They wanted to make something more rafchas. But not at all because there was no room at all. Okay, Zok Gemara by my plea. So what is the machlokes? Because we have a machlokes we're deciding the size of the mizbeach, we had yesterday machlokes. It was all based on the words ravua. It says by the mizbeach and the choishes, and the mizbeach achitzin that we're talking about ravua. It should be square. And the question is, where do we learn this word ravua from? According to Rabbi Yosy, you learn this ravua from the ravua that it says by the mizbeach azov, to learn that the ratio of the height to the width is a constant 1:2. But the Rabbi Yehuda learned that we use ravua to tell us that it's comparable to the mizbeach mentioned in Yecheskel, to tell us that the 5 by 5 dimensions that the Torah tells us for the mizbeach and the choishes is only referring to one quadrant. So really the mizbeach was 10 by 10. So what is the machlokes about where they should compare it to? Should they compare the mizbeach and the choishes to the mizbeach apnimi, like Rabbi Yosy says, or should they compare the mizbeach and the choishes to the mizbeach of the nevuah of Yecheskel, which is referring to also the mizbeach achita? So Zok Gemara, Ma'asav done in chutz mechutz, vein done in chutz mipnim. Rabbi Yehuda holds when you want to use the word revuah to reveal a halacha relevant to the mizbech achitzain, find another place where it says revuah that's also talking about the mizbech achitzain. That's the pasuk in Yecheskel. U'Ma'asav Rabbi Yosy says, done in kli mi kli, vein done in kli mi binyan. You're better off comparing a keli to a keli and not a keli from a binyan. So where are the two kelim that we're talking about? So Rashi, keli, mizbach and the choishes, v'azov, kelimim. When you talk about, we're learning, what do we want to know? We want to know what the dimensions of the mizbech and the choishes was. That's a keli. That's not a stone mizbech. So if we want to learn the size of the mizbech and the choishes, don't learn it from a stone mizbech mentioned in Yecheskel. Rather, learn it from a mizbech of wood and gold. That's the mizbech apnimi, because they're both kelim that we're talking about. So that adjusted what their preferences are, where to learn from, and from there you have the fallout of what the height of the mizbech was, the width of the mizbech was, and therefore what the height of the kloim was, and everything falls into place from there. And what Shlomo Melech really had to do, did he have to just put a bigger mizbech in, or did he actually mekadosh the floor of the avodah zarah? It all stems from what you want to compare the mizbech and the choshes. Amar Rava, Moedi Rabbi Yehuda b'damim. So this is how we started the sugya on Nun Testament Aleph. Rava said that Rabbi Yehuda holds when it comes to the damim, when it comes to spritzing blood, that you cannot spritz on the ritzvah of the Azara, even after Shlomo Melech was mekadosh the Azara, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be dafka on the service of the mizbech. How do we know this? The Tanya we learned. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, this is a famous Gemara, we had it several times, about the Korban Pesach. At the end, when there was a huge flood of blood and guts and everything floating around the Azara, the kohen would take one kois that has everything mixed into it, the remnants of every dam of every carbon that was brought that day, because the Azara was plugged and the water was just building up in it. So you had a big, massive solution with at least a mini, tiny concentration of blood from every carbon that was brought that day in it. And he pours that on the mizbeach. If you hold that Pesach needs shvichas damim, she'im yishafech damai shall achas mehen. If it turned out that one of the multitudes of karbanos that were brought in there Pesach, by mistake, its dam got spilled out, and therefore there was no zrika dam, nimtza zeh machshiroi. At least this little bit, there's a tiny drop content of the dam of every single carbon in this case, that would act as the proper zrika, so that all of the karbonis would be kosher. It would be like a fail-safe plan B mechanism. I'm sorry? Sure.
Is there like a cleaning crew, or is this like, or is it just everything spritz?
No, what happened was at the end of the day, they unplugged it, and then the whole thing flushed out.
In general, yeah,
Every day they cleaned the mizbeach. It's called Trumas Adeshan. Every day they cleaned up they put the fire in the right place, they piled up the ashes. Yeah, every morning was cleaned up. They didn't. I don't think they squeegee. They did it with shovels. I don't know if it was swept clean, but I'm sure the Azara was kept clean. The Azara had to be kept clean. The floor had to be kept clean, because otherwise, if there would be something on the floor, the Kohen's avodah while he's standing on that would be a hefsek. So they probably, I'm sure they scrub it clean every day. They probably flooded it with water and then they sponged it. And if anybody walked by, if anyone walks by, when you walk down Merisham on Friday, you can get splashed with sponge of water that's draining out someone's porch. But there it didn't, because there it just went down into the Amel. Well, there's ash. There's tons of ash that have to be cleaned up. So did they ever wipe down the Mizbeach? I'm sure they did. Well, I don't remember learning a Gemara that specifically talks about it, but they must have. We know that they used to wash the pareches. The Gemara describes what a huge thing it was to wash the pareches and so many people to carry it. Because the Gemara weiter. If you're going to hold that Savar Rabbi Yehuda Kula Azara Mikdasha, if you hold like Rabbi Yehuda, right? If Rabbi Yehuda holds that the whole Azara is like a Mizbeach, so why do I need to scoop up some water, some wine, some blood water with my kois and pour it on the Mizbeach? It fell on the floor. The floor is a Mizbeach. The mitzvah is already done merely by the dam falling on the floor. That's as if it's on the Mizbeach. Because Rabbi Yehuda learns that the floor of the Azara is literally the Mizbeach. Elamah, you have a right from here that the floor wouldn't be eligible for Zrika, even though Rabbi Yehuda said that the floor of the Azara was like the Mizbeach, that's only for Haktar. Practically, no, maybe the Dilma Mishum Tekasavar, Shvicha Mikayacha Adam Be'inam. What was the whole taina? The whole taina was, why do you need to take a cup of this down and pour it on the Mizbeach? If any dam fell on the floor, so that was done already. Dr. Bida, no. The kohen has to make a shvicha. If it happened by itself, that's not called a shvicha. That's not Mekayim the mitzvah. So maybe the reason why he had to do this was because a human has to, a kohen, who's kosher avoida, has to do a proper zrika. That still wouldn't explain why he has to pour it on the mizbeach. Let him just scoop up a cup of dam and then spill it right back down where he got it from. And he shouldn't have to spritz it on the mizbeach without. Elamai, the floor, even though it has kedushas, the mizbeach, it's still not good to spritz blood on. No, maybe really he could have spritzed it on the floor. Why didn't he spritz it on the floor? Because mitzvah min hamufchar, of course, is to spritz the dam of the actual mizbeach. So therefore, you don't have 100% raya that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the damim would not work on the floor. Maybe it would work on the floor. And the reason why he didn't say he poured it on the floor is because he wanted to do mitzvah min hamufchar and spray it on the mizbeach itself. Amar Belozer, a whole new sugya we're moving into. Mizbeach shenifkam. If you have a mizbeach that was nifkam, it became pogum, it became damaged. It's a whole new sugya. Am I on the right half? Is it of samach? Is it of samach? We learned this yesterday. No, it's a new mizbeach shenifkam. A mizbeach that was nifkam. It chipped, a stone chipped off the mizbeach. So the halacha is, it passes everything. Ein oichlin beginoi. And you're not allowed to eat due to the kedusha that this mizbeach it has. You're not allowed to eat any kachim. Ein oichlin beginoi shiyarei mincha. You wouldn't be able to eat shiyarei mincha. So what happened was, is they were makir the koimet mincha, and now they have the shiyarei mincha, and now the mizbeach gets damaged. You cannot even eat the shirayim. You can't eat the shirayim. Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, "V'achlua matzos eitzel hamizbeach." The Torah says, "What do you do with the shiyarei hamincha?" The kohanim eat it. Matzos, meaning it has to be prepared in a non-chometz fashion. And where is it eaten? Near the mizbeach. But that's not true. The mincha was able to be eaten anywhere in the Azara, not only near the mizbeach. So what does it mean when the pasuk tells us eitzel hamizbeach? Elo, what it's telling us is bisman shu shalem v'loi bisman shu chaser. If the mizbeach is pogum, you're not allowed to eat any of the karbanos that were brought. The mincha that was brought might be kosher, you were makter its kmitza, but the shirayim of a carbon may not be eaten, or at least of a carbon mincha may not be eaten if the mizbeach is broken. Achkechan shiyarei mincha. The limud we have is dafka for shiyarei mincha. The pasuk says, clearly the Torah is only talking about the mincha. How do you know by a carbon chatos if the mizbech was nifkam after the shchita and the zrika and aktorah? Now the kohen wants to eat the meat. How do you know that he cannot eat the meat if the Mizbech is pogum. Talmud Loimer Kodesh Kodeshim. It says by the Mincha Kodesh Kodeshim. It says by the Chadas Kodesh Kodeshim, and we learn Exer Shavah. As Rashi says, Exer Shavah the Kodesh Kodeshim Yofli Me'adad. Okay, and what about Kodeshim Kalam? What about Carbon Shlom? All the processing of the carbon was done. Now it's time to eat the meat, and now the Mizbech became Kodeshim. Would you be able to eat the Kodeshim Kalam? Would you be able to eat the Basar Shlomim? Minayin. How do we know there it's prohibited as well? Zok to Gemara, Omer Abaye is Mechadish, also Midrasha Rabbi Yosy. From the Drasha of Rabbi Yosy, which is going to be a little bit of a tangent, we'll be able to deduce from it that any carbon, even Kodeshim Kalam, once the Mizbech is pogum, you can no longer eat it. The Tanya Rabbi Yosy told us something very interesting. And that is, he reported to us that Gimel Dvorim, there were 3 halachas that Rabbi Yosy shared with us that he heard one of each of these 3 from a different Zaken. Gimel Dvorim, he heard from Mishum Gimel's Canaan. So basically, Rabbi Yosy was quoting 3 halachas, one for a Zaken. Now, the Gemara doesn't share with us what all 3 of these drashas are, although they do become a little bit relevant, but the Gemara is focusing on one. Zevachim, and one of the 3 halachas that was quoted by Rabbi Yosy was this drasha. Rabbi Shmuel says, Yochol yala adam meiser sheni l'Yerushalayim. I would have thought that there's a chiyuv to bring your meiser sheni up to Yerushalayim, even bisman hazeh. As Rashi says, why would I think that? Because of our kedushas haaretz loy batla, we still have kedushas haaretz, and therefore utricha hafrashas meiser b'natayra. I mean, Daraisa, you still have to be mafresh trumas and meisers in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, if it's kitcha and there's still a chiyuv for meisers, I would have thought that I have to take all those pears off without being pointed them, and I have to eat them in mamish in Yerushalayim. In other words, the chiyuv of meiser sheni would still be intact today. Vidinu, but I'm going to show you through a svara that in fact the mitzvah of meiser sheni is no longer intact today. Because I learned it from Bechar, and this seems to be like a binyanah. Bechar ton havas moken. The Bechar needs to be brought up to Yerushalayim. We're talking b'dafka about a Bechar that did not have a mum, so it's being brought up as a carbon, and the kohen is going to eat its meat. So Bechar ton havas moken. The Bechar has to be brought to the base of Mikdash, and it has to be brought as a carbon. Umaiser ton havas moken. And we know Meiser has to be brought up to Yerushalayim. Let's compare the two. Ma bechar eino ela b'fnei habayis. Just like bechar, the whole mitzvah of bechar to be makar if it has a carbon is only when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. Af meiser, let's say the whole chiyuv of any type of meiser is only eino ela b'fnei habayis. So we want to make a big enough to say that there's no chiyuv to be mafresh meiser sheni nowadays. Why? Because it's linked to the kedushas hamikdash. If there's no Beis Hamikdash, there's no din ma'aser sheni. Break the Gemara, you can't make such a bidinav because mal bechor shekain ton matan damim. A bechor needs matan damim. Ve'mur legabe mizbeach. A bechor is much more dependent upon the mizbeach, the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, it's logical to suggest that if we don't have that, you can't bring the bechor. But what stops you from bringing up the Ma'aser Sheni to Yerushalayim? Whatever is needed is there. There's no special utilities that are required. So that's not a reason why. That's not a reason why you would still be mechayiv to bring Ma'aser to Yerushalayim. Because Bikurim Yerchichu. Bikurim are also peiros that don't need any avodah. There's no shchita. There's nothing. You just bring them up to Yerushalayim. And Bikurim also no longer applies. So Krashi Bikurim Yerchichu, she'ain tu nematas damim, you don't shech them and put their dam on the mizbeach, yet utrichen bayis, they're still linked to the Beis Hamikdash, k'dichsiv l'fnei mizbeach. It says in the pasuk by Bikurim, v'lokach hakayin atenem yodecha, v'nicha l'fnei mizbach Hashem alokecha. So therefore, from Bikurim we should be able to learn to Meiser that just like there's no Bikurim nowadays, so too there is no longer the Meiser. I'm sorry? but it doesn't need Zrika's dam. That's a very good kasha. So he's asking, but it needs the mizbech, and the Gemara is going to end up saying that in just a minute. Zog to Gemara, bikurim yechichu. Ma'ala bikurim shekain tu'unin hanocha. Exactly what David said. Bikurim also need a connection to the mizbech. It says v'hinicha l'chem mizbech Hashem l'kecha, and Ma'asher doesn't even need that. Zog to Gemara, Talmud Loimar, va'avesem shama oiloi seichem. This is a pasuk that compares all of the karbonis and maishas to each other. And let's have a look at the pasuk. It says over here, "Va'veisam shama oiloi seichem v'zevachim v'esmaishroi seichem v'strumas yetchem v'nidrechem v'nidvas v'nidveseichem." We're comparing all the karbonis to truma and meiser, and therefore they all will have the same halacha. Just like there's no din bechor of a tam nowadays that is brought as a korban, so too there's no din meiser. Makish meiser lebechor. It's a hekesh. It's no longer a binyan. Ma bechor eino ela b'fnei abayis. Af meiser eino ela b'fnei abayis. Frank the Gemara, we a moment ago we said learn it from bechor. The Gemara said bechor needs matam dam on the mizbeach. So the Gemara said to learn it out of bikurim. The Gemara bikurim needs hanoch, right? Why didn't the Gemara make a matzah? Usually when you try to learn from A, it doesn't work by itself. And you try to learn from B, and it doesn't work by itself. You could learn from A and B combined. Why didn't the Gemara try that option? Why didn't Rabbi Shmuel try that option? Why did he jump right away to the hekesh? The tomorrow Rabbi Shmuel knew that wouldn't work. They each have a connection to the mizbeach, although not the same type of connection. The Bechor needs Zrika Stam on the Mizbech, and the Bikurim needs the Hanocha Eitzel Mizbech. But they're both linked. But Meiser is not linked at all. Therefore, the only way I would be able to learn Meiser from Bechor and Meiser from Bikurim is through the Zereshah. Is through the Hekesh. Well, now we're talking about Meiser Sheni. The Dr. Gemara, Ma La Tara Shov Shom Shkiyetz Ben Shabbos. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's figure out what exactly is this svar over here. Now we already pretty much have enough information. This is Rabbi Yosy being medayik from Rabbi Shmuel that all Kodashim columns, like Bechor is Kodashim column, that Kodashim columns, if there's no Mizbeach, you can't eat it. So we've proven it. Since there's no Mizbeach anymore, you can't bring the Bechor anymore. So we've proven our point that Kodashim column gets disqualified. Now, you're going to ask me, how do you have a raya from here that you can't eat it? If there's no Beis HaMikdash, you don't have dam either. Right? So the Gemara is going to say that this pasuk that we learn that Bikurim, that Bechor needs a mizbeach. That's even if you already made the shchita zrika, and then the Beis HaMikdash was harav. Now you have this meat. Even this meat we learn that you can't eat. So therefore, you see that you need the mizbeach for the zrika, that we already know. What we learned today is even if you had the shchita and the zrika, now all you want to do is eat the shirayim. Even for that, you need the mizbeach to be in pristine condition. Gewaltig. Okay, so before we go weiter, no, in a minute we'll get to this. This is an important choice over here. Micah Supper, Frank the Gemara, what is it that Rabbi Shmuel holds that we're being medayik from? So again, Abaye told us that from Rabbi Yosy's report of Rabbi Shmuel's drasha. So somehow from this drasha, we're going to see we learned that you cannot eat kaddish kalam unless the mizbeach is in its pristine condition. So let's see. Micah Supper, what does Rabbi Shmuel hold over here? My Supper Hai Tana the Poshet Le Bechor Meiser. The Tana who's learning Bechor from Meiser through this Hekesh, what does he hold? Ikos over Kedusha Rishayna, Kitcha L'Shaita, the Kitcha L'Asid Lavai. If you hold that even though the Beis HaMikdash was Choreb, it still retained the same Kedusha that it had Bisman Beis HaMikdash Rishayn. If that's what he holds, Ikos over Kedusha Rishayna, Kitcha L'Shaita, the Kitcha L'Asid Lavai. Well, then Afilu Bechor Nami. So why Taka can't you eat the Bechor? The Kedusha is still there. Zokt Rashi. Ikosava Kedusha Rishayna Shel Kedusha Kitcha l'shaita v'kitcha l'salavoi kehechad is tvir lebekdusha sa'aretz. Just like he holds that the kedusha sa'aretz remains even though the Beis Hamikdash was charev and Klal Yisrael was thrown into Golos. V'kamaboyle mikarina be'lefnei aleikecha oiloi v'kapashet ma'aser mi'bechor. You bring a raya from Bechor to Meiser. Why is Bechor any more clear to you than Meiser? Afilu Bechor nami, afilu Bechor yakrav v'yoichel. Why taka aren't you makrav Bechor? How do you know you're not? The man that Islay Kitcha Los and Lovoi, if you hold Kitcha Los and Lovoi, Islay happens to hold Shemakrivin Alpha Pishin bias. The sheet is who hold that Kitcha Rishon and Kitcha Los and Lovoi means today you can bring a carbon. You can actually go and bring a carbon. So what's the problem? Because the base of English was horrible. Everything is still business as usual. Why couldn't you be makrav and eat that? Zog to Gemara. So the ika sover, and if you're going to say loy kitchen loss of lavoi, and that's why you can't process the bechar, well then afilu bechar namit boy. So then why taka are you saying that you don't bring a bechar? Look Rashi, because over like kitchen afilu bechar namit boy, because over kedushas bayis bottle. Let's say you hold that there's no more kedushas Beis Hamikdash, and you couldn't shech, and you couldn't make zrikas adam anymore, because now we don't have kedusha. Umi boyale. What? And the Gemara only has a shaila by Meiser. But Meiser, why should Meiser be different? Since it doesn't need the Beis Hamikdash, you're just bringing it to Yerushalayim, but you don't need a functioning of the Beis Hamikdash. The question was, Mimis Achal B'Lu Yerushalayim, does it still need to be eaten in Yerushalayim? Well, guess what? A Bechar, you can ask the same shaila. Afilu Bechar Kagav the Nami Tevoilei. Kivon Shekagoyin Shekarvu Domo Ve'Murav Bechar Babayis. What happens if you don't need the Beis Hamikdash anymore? Why? Because all of the avodah that was supposed to be done was done. Imagine they're in the middle of processing a bechar, they shecht it, they make this rika, and now the carbon is already hutar, and under normal conditions the carbon would eat the meat. And what happens? The Beis Hamikdash becomes chor. Now you have this meat, ubesarikayim, my sheichlu. The Gemara names on for sure that by the bechar you couldn't eat it anymore. It's bottled. You need the Beis Hamikdash. Mechadesa. Where do you see anywhere? I'm asking you how you see that you couldn't make Zrikas Adam anymore. That maybe you hold, but who said you can't eat it anymore? So if you're using Bechar as an anchor to teach us, to Meiser, that it's dependent on the Beis Hamikdash, how do you know that Bechar is dependent on the Beis Hamikdash at this stage of the game after you were already processed? Really, he holds loy kitcha. And therefore, we have a problem. Why? How does he know for sure that by Bechar, we're talking about where the Zrika happened already. So how does he know that by Bechar it's for sure Asr? Now, you're going to notice that this Hachabamai Skinon sounds like it's a new case. No, it's repeating exactly what I said a moment ago. And the Hachabamai Skinon of Rashi is lav dafka. The Hachabamai Skinon, Bechar, Shenizrak Domoi, Koidim Churban Abayis, and then Bechar Abayis. Which is exactly what we said in the kasha. So what changed? What changed is the iskish b'sarai l'dam. By every other carbon, yes, you could separate the two. You were makrib the dam while the mizbech was kaim, while the mizbech was intact. Everything breaks down. Now the question is the basar connected, or the basar you could still eat there in Yerushalayim? Maybe by another carbon you'd be able to. But by the Bechor, there's a link. It's a mitzvah. So Zok to Gemara, what does it say here in the pasuk? It says, it's a pasuk that we've dealt with a lot in the last couple of days. Ach Bechor shor, oy Bechor kesef, oy Bechor eis, loy sifta koydeshem, es damam tizrak ala mizbeach, ve'eschelbam taktir. If you remember, we learned over here, damam loshen plural, chelbam loshen plural, to include a korban pesach and Meiser Behema as well. That's what we learned from this a couple of days ago. But now we're saying the fact that the Torah puts Damam and Chelbam and Besaram side by side, we say Ishkas Besarai Ladamai. The basar of the carbon will share a status with the dam. Ma damai b'mizbeach. Just like the dam of the carbon could only be spritz on the mizbeach, and if there's no mizbeach, there's no carbon, and the whole thing is not relevant. Af Besarai b'mizbeach. So too, you're not allowed to eat the basar unless there's a mizbeach. So how do I know that even though it's loy kitcha, I can no longer eat the meat of the Bechor, even though it was already processed properly. We know it from the Hekesh Mineu Bay in the pasuk of Bechor that says Basar is similar to Dam. Once I know that Basar is similar to Dam, because I learned it from a Hekesh from Dam, then with another Hekesh, I can say the same thing applies to Meiser. Right, the Gemara, this violates the rule that we spend blatter learning. How could you teach this halacha with the hekesh that the Ma'aser Sheni is not again now that there's no base of mikdash? How could you teach that with the hekesh if you only know it by basar of the bechor from a hekesh from dam? Zok the Gemara, no problem. Ma'aser dagan hulunu. What are we talking about? Ma'aser Sheni. We're talking about Ma'aser that's from fruits. That's all chulun. That's all chulun. It doesn't have a status of kachim, so it doesn't have this rule. Zok Gemara, we had a discussion about that already. If you just follow the recipient and if about the recipient is chulun, you say this rule doesn't apply, you're right. You're fine. You can make this hekesh. But if you look at the source, and in this case the source is bechor, which is kachim, ma'ikal meimar. Zok Gemara, it's not really a hekesh from dam to basar, because we look at dam ubasar chada milsehi. We don't really consider that limud from dam to basar. We don't consider it a hekesh. We consider that one and the same. Gewaltig. Now we have one little complication over here, and that is what we learned from Rashi. So let's have a quick peek at Tosfos. Zok Tosfos, my kosavar haitana. Does he hold kitcher rishon and kitcher lasad lavai, or only kitcher lashayda? Zok Rashi, Tosfos is quoting the pshita lei bechor tvei mi meiser. The Gemara wants to know why is it that bechor we seem to be sure that you couldn't eat the bechor once the base of mikdash wasn't there, once the mizbech was hard. And the question is, do you apply that to meiser as well? Why are you more sure by bechor than you are by meiser? Because savar kitcher lasad lavai. If you hold kitcher rishon and kitcher lasad lavai, the kedushas haaretz and the kamaboile and the shaila is, even though that's kedushas haaretz, but it's a kal lefnei Hashem, which is where you're supposed to eat the ma'aser sheni, and the kamaboile ikarina bei lefnei Hashem, Eloi. Well, then afilu bechar nami yikrav v'yoichal. Then if it is lefnei Hashem, well, the bechar, the gabi the bechar is also lefnei Hashem, and you should be able to eat it. The man that is like kitcha kasaver the makrivin aval b'shem bayis, as Rashi quoted, which Tosfos is requoting. If you hold kitcha la'asad lava, you can actually be makav karbanis nowadays, because the land is the land. Perakam the Megillah. V'ikos over loy kitcha, and if you hold loy kitcha, the botla kedushas aretz, and therefore when we boil it by meiser and we're clearing by meiser, mishum de einoi tzarach lebayis. The meiser does not need a beis hamikdash; it just needs the city of Yerushalayim. Umas achol Yerushalayim, and the question was: is ikarini bei lefnei Hashem? Yerushalayim, now that there's no more kedushas beis hamikdash, is it called lefnei Hashem Eloi? And that would tell us whether or not you have to bring up the meiser sheni. But that's the parameter of the question. Then you have the same question by bechor. I feel bechor nami tiboye. In such a case, if it was similar to meiser, for instance, if it's a case of bechor where right now you don't need the base of mikdash anymore, why don't you need the base of mikdash? Shekarvu dama ve'murav. Everything was processed. You just have the meat left over that the kohen was going to eat, and then bechor of habayis u'v'sarakayim ma'u sheyachlu umasik. And the Gemara concludes the kasaver like kitcha. If that's how you learn, if it's loy kitcha, so what's the shaila by meiser? If Eretz Yisrael lost its kedusha, there's no chiv to bring meiser anymore at all. That's Tosfos' kash. Vim timer ikasaver loy kitcha hechi mishkachas meiser sheni deraisa. How are you going to have meiser sheni deraisa that you can clear about it if you have to eat it l'fnei Hashem or not? If it's loy kitcha, there is no more meiser sheni, because part of the kedusha's ours is to be mechayiv you on meiser. So, Tosfos, this whole shiloh doesn't make sense. Mimonashah. If you hold kitcha, then you can eat it up there, and if you hold loy kitcha, there's no meiser. So, Tosfos has two options. One is maybe it's speaking that you had meiser left over from last year. Now you couldn't create new meiser. You had meiser left over from last year. The Beis Hamikdash is horrible. That's what the Gemara is discussing. That's one pshat. The other pshat is a very innovative pshat where Tosfos says that maybe there's a difference between Kedushas Eretz Yisrael and Kedushas Beis Hamikdash. So Tosfos says, he wants to say that maybe you could separate them. Where does he say that? Here. So it could be the Kedusha of Yerushalayim and the Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash is bottled, but the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael remains. And to trigger a Chiv Meiser, you only need Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, not Kedusha of Yerushalayim. To eat it L'fnei Hashem, you need Kedusha of Yerushalayim. So therefore, you would have a Chiv Meiser because the Kedusha of Eretz was never in this battle, but maybe the special Kedusha of Yerushalayim, which was a higher level of Kedusha, could be that was this battle. Okay, let's continue on so we can finish of it. Kisolik, when he went up to Eretz Yisrael, Kisolik Ravin, when Ravin went up to Eretz Yisrael, Amr L'Shmai to Kamei Di Rabbi Yirmiyah. He told over the halacha that Abaye brought a raya from Rabbi Yosy, who said over Rabbi Shmuel's halacha that it must be that Kadosh of Kalim you cannot eat if the Mizbech is damaged. And Rabbi Yirmiyah didn't like this pshat. And you know what he said? Amar Bavaloy Tipshoy. The people from Bavel are Tipshim. It's very, very offensive to this pshat. Why? Amatul, the Yasvi Ba'archa Shucha. Since they live in the lowlands, Bavel were lowlands, meaning they didn't have such exposure to sun, darkened areas. Amri Shmaitze the Machashcha. They say dark things. They say things that aren't lichtig, that don't make sense. Loy Shemilahu, didn't you hear Hadatanya? We had a brisa that taught us B'shas Siluk Masois, when Klal Yisrael was taking down the Mishkan and starting to travel as they did regularly in the Midbar. At that point, Kadashim Nifsalim, any Kachim become possible. Zotrashi Basar Kachim will become possible. Vikasol Kadaitach, and you know why it became possible? The Gemara feels at this point, Mipnei Siluk HaMizbechi, because there's no Mizbeach. So you see clearly that you cannot eat kachim l'chol hapachos once the mizbech is dismantled, and v'zovin u'mitzayroyin mishtachim chutz l'mechitza, meaning it still has a din of Yerushalayim. There's no mizbeach, but it still has a din of Yerushalayim. Because if it didn't have a din of Yerushalayim, why do you send out the zovim and the mitzayroyin? So it must be, it still has a status of Yerushalayim, and it's just because the mizbech is dismantled, that's why you cannot eat kachim anymore. But it also says, contradictory Brisa, Betanya Idich, Bishnei Mekayimos, Hachim Nechalim. Kadashim can be eaten in two places. What does that mean in two places? Sai when the machne is in place, the Mizbech is there, and Sai when it's dismantled. So you have a stira. The first Brisa said, Kachim are Nifsalim, the moment they take the machne apart. But the second Brisa says, Bishnei Mekayimos, Kachim Nechalim, meaning Sai if it's dismantled, and Sai if it's combined. My love, how could you for this stira? Kalam. So you have a mafurish brisa that says that you could eat kachim kalam, even though the Beis Hamikdash, even though Mizbech is dismantled. So you have a black and white raya and make it Abaye. Zokar Birmi, I don't know what type of Torah you're saying from Rabbi Shmuel. From this stira in Brisa, it's quite clear that yes, kodesh kachim, there's a hekesh to mincha that you can't eat with the Mizbech is not intact, but kachim kalam, aval you can eat even though the Mizbech is dismantled. Amar Ravina, we can for this, and we could say that everybody agrees even kachim kalam can't be eaten. So what does it mean? Bishnei mekayimos kachim nechalim, idi v'idi about kachim kalam. They're both speaking about kachim kalam. V'loy kasha. It's not shver. A stira that one brayso says kachim kalam could be eaten, and one brayso says kachim kalam can't be eaten. Har Rabbi Shmuel. Maybe one brayso is going according to Rabbi Shmuel. Our Rabbi Shmuel, who we're bringing a raya from, who holds that you cannot eat kachim kalam because you learned it from Bechor. Rabbanon, maybe the Rabbanon argue. Okay, we'll stop here. Tomorrow is a very long day, so we'll stop here, and Bez Hashem, we will continue tomorrow. I got to know what the Tosfos to say it. Shkoyach, everybody should have an awesome day.